Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity. I've been talking about my top 25 favorite episodes of Star Trek. This is planning to be a monthly series where each month I'll count down a different episode on my list. Of course, beginning the list with my number 25, the original series episode Balance of Terror. And so, to liven the discussions, not just me, I'm joined by two special guests to talk about this episode. First, joining Don, the Romulan of Ice and Fire. Thanks so much for joining, Don.
Yeah, live long and prosper or something or whatever. Who cares? Finally, we get to meet my people.
And also joining me, as always, regular guest, my sister Alyssa Jean. Thanks so much, Alyssa.
Hello, and Mark, don't forget there's no room for bigotry on my bridge.
Indeed. Absolutely. All right, so yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into it. We'll start with Alyssa. I'll start with you. What were your overall thoughts on this episode?
So I actually, my opinion of this episode or how much I enjoy watching this episode, I should say, has increased since Equality of Mercy came out. And I know we're not going to get too much into that episode, but I did a top 10 best Star Trek original series episode list back in my Acton Tomko days, and this made my top 10 best list. And then when I came out with my Alyssa Jean channel, I changed it to my 10 favorite. And then this wasn't on it because I thought objectively this is one of the best episodes. It's a really high quality episode. It's a really important episode in Trek history. But when I thought about like 10 episodes that I want to sit down and enjoy and get enjoyment out of, this wasn't quite on the list. Like I kind of found it a little dry, especially in the beginning of it, and the Styles thing is. We'll talk about that. That bugs me a little bit. Also, parts of it were a little antiquated, which is not a fault of this episode, but it's just a reason why I didn't like enjoy it as much. So even though like I was like, it's like when you look at a film that like is nominated for an Oscar, and you like objectively, that's a really like masterpiece. Like it's a piece of art. It's a really good work, but I don't really enjoy sitting there watching it. And that's kind of how it's not that I didn't enjoy, but I didn't enjoy it as much as a top 10 favorite episode for me. But I don't know. Since Quality of Mercy, I've watched it a couple more times. That I think, like thinking of it in that context, because Quality of Mercy is caused me to look at this episode and just appreciate how good of a Captain Kirk is in this episode. He's badass. Whereas I think there are lots of examples of him not being such a great captain, especially in some of the bad episodes where he just says prime directive, schmime directive, and just like does what he wants. But this is an example of like, oh, I see why people say Captain Kirk is a really good captain. He's a badass. And so I think I do appreciate this episode a lot more. It's still, if I were to redo a top 10 favorite, it'd be close. It might be in there now. But it's definitely one of the best in the original series, regardless.
Awesome. Okay, and Don, your thoughts on the episode?
Why will it not let me unmute? How dare So, finally, we get the introduction to the Romulans, but one thing that I had an issue with, and it doesn't take away from the entire episode, but it does kind of take away from the entire episode, is you people have built starships. You can traverse the galaxy at light speed and beyond. And yet somehow you don't have a visual record of a species you ran into from 100 years ago. I mean, if anything, they could have just said espionage, something. But you're telling me that, you ran into a species from 100 years ago. We're not talking about pre-warp days. And yet there's no visual record of what the species looks like. So when you finally meet one, and it turns out he looks like the first officer of the ship, everybody's, oh my god, I can't believe this. But beyond that, no, I actually really loved the episode. But that's just the one nagging thing because without that kind of without some sort of explainer for me, and this is the thing that I just recently thought of. Now it's kind of like, yeah, um, Starfleet can't be that dumb, can it? Yeah. Okay, all right, all right. I'm just gonna suspension of disbelief.
But overall, you do like the episode a lot.
Yes, I mean, listen, we got introduced to the Romulans, and we got to see how very different they were from their cousins. You know, um, the whole aggressive imperial thing going on, and just the fact that it's like, oh wait, no, we're used to the guys with the pointy ears and the Caesar haircut, all having the same, like, I am emotionless, I am a human robot. It was like, wait, you guys have inflections to your voice. Who are you? Does not compute. So yeah, it was interesting to see kind of a species that has separated and formed two different branches, and to see like how different their cultures are, how different their mannerisms are, and their politics, everything. So yeah, that was a very interesting thing to see for this episode that I love that they introduced, because you as the viewer now have to kind of decide like, okay, well, if I was on this crew, like how would I look at Spock? You know, or also it's like, hey, well, are these bad guys really the bad guys? Because I mean, they look just like people who are our allies. People who helped to start the Federation, and they come from they officially actually do come from the same planet. But why are they so different? So there are many things about this episode that, to me, make it a standout. But like I said, when I started thinking about that one nagging thing,
No, that is totally fair there. Now, real quick, I do want to say hello to everyone in the chat. Norman Buchwald, Brandon, thanks so much for joining. Noah actually caught the scream. Good, glad you're here. And Jordan Johnson, thanks so much for joining. Now, Norman says something tells me that the incident may show up twice in Mark's countdown. I won't spoil the countdown for you, but you do know me well, Norman. Anyway, and Brandon, let's see, hold on, was saying Alyssa's ready to tell off Styles. Yep, absolutely. And let's see, something else I wanted to. Oh yeah, Brandon also saying the maps make me giggle. Yeah, the maps are so outdated. But that's the original series. As I'm covering the original series, I'm saying that's kind of like low hanging fruit, because my favorite thing is like this meme I saw from the cage where this yeoman was handing Pike like a piece of pad of paper, and Pike was like, paper? This is the 23rd century. Why are we using paper? Which I thought was funny. But anyway, so this is, of course, my 25th favorite episode of the franchise, or at least that's how I'm calling it. I think it was my third favorite episode of the original series. Well, I always liked this episode growing up. Sort of gravitated. What really got me, what I like most about this episode, of the way it humanizes the villain, which is something I think, especially at the young age, I wasn't used to seeing in TV and movies. And how this isn't like, it's not really portrayed as an evil guy. He's kind of doing what he's doing for political purposes. And it really, you see his point of view, and you see that him and Kirk actually sort of are two of a kind, and they're similar, two people locked in this cat and mouse game. I think this is kind of I think to this day remains one of my favorite examples of that sort of story being told, of the battle of wits for two people who are evenly matched. And I like how the villain is not, and I love how he's not trying to kill Kirk for killing his wife or some shit, which the current Star Trek franchise seems to love to do over and over and over again. So I do like that dynamic to it, and just had the way it humanizes the Romulans, and then the interpersonal relationships between the Kirk and his crew itself, I thought was great. And the bookends is something that really got me, like the whole thing about the marriage and the husband dying. So I've always really liked this episode. It's always been one of my favorites of the original series. Oh yes, and Jordan Johnson says RIP Mark Leonard. Yeah, he was amazing in this episode. I could see why they brought him back to be play Sarek, although it was weird because I saw the movies and I saw like Journey to Babel before I saw this episode, and it went on the view screen. I'm like, hey, it's Sarek. Why is Sarek trying to kill them? But anyway, no, he did do a really good job in this episode. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and tackle some of the specifics of the episode. I want to start with the marriage that I mentioned. We get the marriage scene at the start of the episode. I did want to call out all the different marriages that we've had in the Star Trek franchise, because I looked this up out of curiosity, because that little speech that Kirk gives at the start of the episode, I was like, when he says, we're gathered here since the days of wooden ships or whatever, I don't have it written down, but I was under the impression that that speech got reused multiple times in the franchise, but it actually, when I looked it up, according to my research, it hasn't. The closest thing is Picard said the same thing with when Keiko and O'Brien got married, but it was similar. They actually saw it written out, and there were some like slight differences to it. But other examples of people getting married, when Captain Sisko married Ramalita, there's the demon planet or the biomedic version of Voyager. We saw Tom and B'Elanna's wedding. Benjamin Sisko and Cassidy Yates got married by Admiral Ross. Worf and Dax, of course, married. Riker and Troy married in Nemesis. And let's not forget the most important wedding, the Gorn wedding, as seen in Star Trek Lower Decks. but this is sort of had the tradition. I think a majority of those marriage weddings I listed were they seemed to me like they were modeled off of this. And then, of course, there was a recreation of this wedding in Equality of Mercy. Also can't forget about that. So I like the fact that they started with this wedding and they showed these two characters throughout the scene. Let's kind of gloss over the way the original series portrays women. That's, something I've always had a problem with throughout. But at least, she's an officer on the ship. Just the way she's like, I'm going to marry you, mister. It seemed a bit silly. But I do like how they went back to these characters. And I thought the ending where the, husband-to-be just so happens to be the only guy who died on the ship. But the fact that he died and Kirk has to try to consolidate her, and he's just like, it doesn't make any sense. But she's just like, it's okay. And it seemed like Kirk is more sort of broken up by, well, not more, but I think the way they chose to end this episode with him just walking down the corridors after having that sort of tragic moment, to me, that really hit me hard. And that's one of the things about this episode I love. So anyway, Alyssa, let's start with you. Your thoughts on this whole wedding side plot.
Well, yeah, it's nice in the really rare times where a character died, like a side character, a background character dies, and they're not wearing a red shirt, and it's not just like Kirk's like, oh well, like it's just like red shirts get killed all the time, and Kirk does not give a crap about them. Like I always laughed at the Changeling episode, the Nomad episode, where Kirk was just like, there's this killer robot, and Kirk's like, hey, red shirts, go escort the killer robot. disintegrates them. That's terrible, Captain. Like, you're a terrible captain. Like, so when they actually have a meaningful death of a background character, and the rare times that they do it, I always really appreciate that, and I do like that as a framing device. I did also kind of want to make a comment. This is kind of related, but how he dies. He's down in the phaser room, and the smoke comes out or whatever, and Styles is down there, and Spock's able to save him. But is this a thing in any other episodes? I feel like this maybe there's some other early ones where they're in this. It looks like he's in a basement, and he's Kirk's fire phasers, firing phaser number 1, firing phaser number 2. And then at the end, when he dies, Styles is down there too, and Kirk's like, "Fire! Why aren't you firing? Fire! Fire!" Because that smoke is coming out of whatever the gas.
Yeah.
And Spock goes in and leans over and hits the buttons and fires the phasers in time, and then rescues Styles, but is not able to save the other dude. But usually, Sulu will just do it from. So I don't know how many. This isn't something I noticed. I don't know how many other episodes do it that way. But so in any other episodes, he wouldn't die because they don't have phaser shot from other rooms.
Yeah.
But I mean, there may be other early first season episodes that do that. I don't recall. But
so I just watched the first season and the first part of the second season, and there are no other episodes for this. And I remember seeing this episode for the first time. This really stood out to me. It's what? There's a phaser room? But this is an early episode. I think it was the 10th one made, so it was before they really solidified. After this episode, I guess on second thought, let's not have a phaser room. This is a silly place.
Yeah. So if it had been a different episode, he wouldn't have died because he would have been down there in the phaser room. But anyways, that's a sidetrack. The point I was making is I do appreciate that they're killing off a side character and making it meaningful, and Kirk actually is affected by it. Kirk is visibly affected by it, which in other episodes he's retro.
All right, so I went to address Norman in the chat that says, when I was listing off the wedding, saying, "Don't forget the muse." I would like to forget the muse, so thank you. But it's funny because when I got the list, I got it from Memory Alpha, and they didn't have the muse listed, so I guess they forgot about it. They hate the muse as much as I do. But anyway, John, your thoughts on this whole marriage storyline?
Marriage, who needs it? Look at how it can cause war or supposedly stop war or do whatever. Look, the point is, yeah, I mean, when you got somebody running around talking about, "You're going to marry me, mister," or "I'm going to," thinking about the early days of Star Trek, and I guess them trying to break barriers on certain levels. You just think about how antiquated certain ideas or certain lines come off, and that's definitely not something, especially these days. That's not something you would ever hear a person utter and expect to still have a career after that. So every now and then bumping up against things of that nature and and their weird wedding planning customs that they had introduced into Star Trek back then. It's all right, this is interesting, but I don't exactly know why I need this at all. But like you guys were talking about, as far as having the death of a side character and it actually being meaningful. I mean, look, this is definitely one of the few times in the early days of Star Trek where where they were able to pull this off, or where they even attempted to, because like you stated earlier, most of the time somebody dies with a red shirt. It's like, oh, okay, hey, we need somebody to die pronto. You got your shirt off? Here, go and grab the red shirt. You'll be right back. you know, but this time it was a character that actually, even though they were only around for this one episode, still, um, they still made you feel something. Excuse me, they still made you feel something in that short amount of time. And it's funny because sometimes seeing the acting, uh, the very theatrical, over the top kind of stuff from back then, as opposed to now, it sometimes can take me out of it, but this was one of the few times where I actually didn't. So kudos.
No, I actually agree about that. For the most part, I think it's one of the original series episodes that holds up most, pretty well. Well, another thing I wanted to mention about the character who was going to get married, Angela Martinez, is that she appeared very shortly after in the episode Shore Leave, where she was hooking up with another guy. So I guess she got over this guy very fast, which I thought was very weird. But of course, the story behind that is they just hired the same actress, and I was like, oh, she's already been on the show. Well, let's just call her the same name as the other character. It wasn't actually written that way. But anywho, so let's go ahead and move on. I want to talk about something Don touched on earlier, the Romulan War history that we're given, the background. So he already mentioned a huge flaw about this, of how they have no idea what the Romulans look like. They've never seen one before because there was no view screen technology yet, on Archer's Enterprise. He had a view screen. He was the first ship in Starfleet. But, you can say that was a retcon later on. But I've talked about this before, and I think it's something that should be retconned. In fact, it's a shame that Enterprise actually, they were going to do a Romulan War storyline in its 5th season. They never got to do it, obviously, because it got canceled. But I would have liked to have seen it, and I would have mind if they retconned some of the things. I wouldn't mind if they actually did see a Romulan. And there's some things that they did retcon, like they said that, yeah, they didn't have view screens. That's already been changed. They said they fought the war using primitive nuclear weapons. Enterprise didn't have, Archer's Enterprise didn't have nuclear weapons. So, but I would have liked to have seen this, and maybe they still could, one day, sort of delve into the backstory of the Romulan War and how it was described. But, and yeah, as Brandon pointed out earlier, that map looks freaking ridiculous. But I think it was interesting. It was one of the first examples of lore building in the original series, and that's why I don't really hold it against it, because they weren't expecting to build a 60-year thriving franchise when they made this episode, which is why I'd be okay with them retconning some things to fit into the wider franchise. But I thought it was an interesting setup for this episode itself. Don, I'll get your thoughts on this first.
Sorry, this thing just doesn't. Why do you not want to let me speak? Again, so a lot of this episode, when it comes to them kind of showing off differences in culture, this was like I said, this was the first time you get to see a sort of branch species. So them, interacting with the Romulans for the first time in 100 years, but not having any sort of records of them, of what they actually look like, because apparently they couldn't see them. I was just like, all right, that's a little out there. That 100 years ago, you guys didn't have view screens, but maybe there might have been something that happened that did not allow for view screens for a specific amount of time. I don't know, too much drain on the dilithium chamber or something. Whatever may have you. But even if they had seen them before, I guess now this is the first time where they're actually getting to interact with them in a way that's not 100% hostile, but obviously it turns very, very hostile. Um, but again, getting into just to see the difference in how they operate, because and I want to call him Sarek, even though it's not that's not the character's name here. But you see how he's interacting with Kirk, and Kirk is to a certain extent almost like, do I really want to fight him? Like I feel like we could be friends. We could be buddies if we could just get past whatever this whole social thing, because two different governing styles. Um, and it kind of mirrors the real world in that regard, because you'll have people who are from opposing teams or countries, and it's like, oh yes, I like this person, but I just don't happen to like the government that they work for. So unfortunately, even though we could be friends, we can't be friends. Um, so yeah, it's just interesting to see how you have this culture clash, and but the the funny thing about it is the way that the Romulans are portrayed in the original series is not how they're portrayed later on. So this is very yeah, it's one of those things. It's kind of like, well, what the hell happened to these guys? But because I prefer the original Romulans better. The ones that they became by the time they're in TNG and Deep Space Nine. I'm like, I don't like you guys. You guys aren't cool anymore. You're just jerks now. And there's no reason to be like that when you were so mellow.
Well, fair enough, fair enough. And Alyssa, your thoughts on the Romulan war history?
Yeah, I think. See, this is one of the things I was talking about when I say that it's antiquated, and there are things that you just have to overlook when you watch it now. And like they haven't thought of Starfleet yet, so they're calling everything Earth Base 1 and Earth Base 2, and there's, I mean, which is really unoriginal too. Just there's 1, 2, 3, 4 Earth Base, whereas later you would have Starbase 67 or whatever. This is another one of those things. I think that the purpose of them framing the war that way was so that they could all be surprised when they see that the Romulans look like Vulcans. But I'm wondering, why could they have just said that they had never seen the Romulans with their funny little helmets off? Because most of them have these funny little helmets. So they could have said that they saw them before, but they never saw them without their helmets off and didn't realize that they looked like Vulcans. If they wanted to still have that surprise and go dun 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 dun, dun, raise his eyebrow, and still do that, I think that would have made more sense. I don't think they were thinking it through to think, oh, there wouldn't be view screens 100 years ago. Like, I mean,
well, if I may, real quick, and then the other question you have to ask is, why did Spock not tell them? Because
he didn't know. He didn't know that the Romulans were Vulcans.
Yeah, you get that impression. He was just as surprised.
Yeah, he was. He was as surprised as they were, and
I guess
he theorizes in the episode. Well, most likely the Romulans are an offshoot of our Vulcan ancestors.
I guess maybe because he kind of threw that out there so quick, I thought that maybe he might have known, but. Yeah, you know what? Thinking back on it, yes, you're right. Because they should have gave his Spock surprise look.
Yeah, it even looks better on the Quality Mercy when they do it with Ethan Peck, like they go dun, dun, and focus in on him and he raises an eyebrow. And so I think he says fascinating.
Yeah.
When they do that. And so, yeah, he was as surprised as anyone. And I think it would have made more sense to just say, oh, well, they never saw them with their helmets off. It doesn't make a lot of sense to say that they never saw them. And then as far as Enterprise had the Romulans, and they kept with, oh, we don't see them. They're this mysterious bad guy in the background, and we don't see them. But my question is, when did this war happen in relation to Enterprise? Because does it happen after Archer? I mean, because it didn't mention that the war had already happened. I just watched those Enterprise episodes.
Yeah.
so it happened sometimes after that, and they still do. So I kind of, you're right, Mark. They retconned everything else. The nuclear weapons and the no view screens and that. They pretended like those lines didn't exist. So Enterprise may as well have just pretended that they saw the Romulans too.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't really, sometimes there's these things in canon, and especially early on in the original series, that you just gotta let go. And sometimes modern Trek wants to hang on to them, and you would have the canon hawks, of course, if they change it. That's not in canon, but sometimes you gotta let some things go. Another example is from the Menagerie, the death penalty for going to a
God, yes. That was dumb.
Which they held on to when they went back to that planet in Discovery. They still mentioned that there was a death penalty, which there wouldn't be a death penalty just for going to a planet. So some things like that they should retcon, and they didn't. Because it's one of those kind of antiquated things that you just sort of like you gotta look past when you're watching this episode and enjoy it despite. You just get the fact it was made in the 60s. It was one of the early episodes before the canon was really established.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's just something you gotta sort of just look beyond and enjoy the episode for being good. And the problem of when the Romulan War happened isn't as big of a problem as when the Eugenics War happened in 1993.
Well, I feel like Strange New Worlds kind of retconned it so it happened later.
Did they? I know that Picard season 2 was implying, the Khan project that it was going to happen after 2024.
Yeah, that was going to happen, but it hadn't happened yet.
Yeah,
it's kind of all over the place as to when when the Eugenics War actually happened. Brandon says in 2156, Earth forces in the Romulan Empire entered the state of war. I don't know where you're getting that from, but Enterprise ends in, I think it's like 2154 or something. So the Memory Alpha, is that where you got that?
Yeah, the wiki,
yeah. So it's like right after Enterprise they get into the war with the Romulans.
I mean that would fit. I mean it was before the Federation was founded, but then it would have to be before These Are the Voyages. Then if it's before the Federation was founded, it would have to be in that time between. Yeah, that was jumped over in the finale. But I don't know. Yeah. But they were planning on doing in the 5th season. That would have kept been in keeping in it.
Well, the Federation isn't founded in These Other Voyagers. That's like the coalition.
Very good point. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, maybe it could have been after that. Yeah. But, anywho, let's see. I'm trying to find my notes of what I wanted to talk about. Oh, yeah. So, I wanted to talk more specifically about this episode, the Romulan attacks on the outposts, which were like they have this, and this is something that's not even true to later episodes of the original series, but I guess I could say this weapon was outdated. They had this very powerful weapon that was able to destroy a whole outpost, yet it used all their energy to use it, and so they couldn't. And they couldn't fire while cloaked, which is something actually that stayed with Star Trek lore. But I've watched some other videos and heard some interesting theories about why the Romulans are attacking. Now, something that made sense is that, and this is based off of the Romans, and it does seem very apparent to me, obviously Romulans, that they're basing the species, making them Roman-like. And apparently the thing with the Romans that they would start wars and they would invade other countries in order to boost their own economy. It wasn't necessarily they wanted to conquer a particular place. It's not necessarily they wanted more land. They didn't have anything against the people they were attacking. They just fed the war machine, which fed the economy, which modern day things, but we'll leave that aside and focus more on the Romans. But yeah, and I think that's kind of what they were saying with this episode, is that they were trying to strengthen the Romulan Empire by just having a war so they could have more industry and war and stuff. And so they were testing the waters with the Federation to see if it was viable to have a war. And of course, Equality of Mercy kind of touched on this more, that had Kirk not handled this correctly, then a war would have been started and the Romulans would invade. But because he did show strength and outwitted, but that was sort of the Romulans' motivation for attacking here. So anyway, Alyssa, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't really have much to add to that. I mean, I think that you kind of, summarized it. So,
all right,
yeah,
no worries. All right, Don, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I like how Star Trek takes ancient cultures every now and then, or ancient myths, and repurposes them for the modern audience, at least the audience at the time. And I definitely like the fact that they kind of juxtapose the way that the Romulans did things to the Federation, even though what they call Federation. Um, but just to kind of show Kirk, it gives him a glimpse into a totally different thing, that it's like, you know what, this, to a certain extent, this could have been what we became, and this is, obviously, prior to like the Mirrorverse episodes or whatever, but just showing like between the Romulans, Klingons, and whatever other empires are out there, like this this is one of those things that uh he got to see something from the past, almost almost like a relic of Earth's past, and to see that to see how these people are still, to a certain extent, not dissimilar, because they have order, they have structure, they have their own sort of goals that aren't necessarily all evil, but like you said, they do feed a war machine. It's one of those things where, yes, they're doing this because, like the Romans, it's like, hey, the more we conquer, the more we have to conquer in order to keep things going. So, yeah, this is not even anything about like, oh, we hate people from this planet because they're not Romulan. It's like, no, every time we have a war, we promise our soldiers that they're going to get spoils from the war, and the only way to keep on getting spoils is to conquer more stuff, because a general moves up and he's like, hey, you know what, I want a bigger palace. Only way for me to get a bigger palace is to go conquer somewhere else, so this way I can give my troops whatever, so I can get my bigger palace, and so on and so forth. So I do like um, yeah, I do like the fact that they showed not only Kirk but us as the audience kind of a different side, in what we as humanity could actually be, to a certain extent, if left unchecked.
Yes, and it is certainly much better than when Kirk actually visited the Romans and that stupid episode Bread and Circuses. There just so happened to be another planet far out in the galaxy where it just happened to have an exact copy of Rome, except in 20th century technology. But anyway. But the whole thing with I realized, because I believe they mentioned Romulan and Remus in this episode, which is how later the Nemesis said, oh, let's do a Remus thing, which is, I think, kind of dumb. But Romulus and Remus is, of course, a real life thingy, and that just put it, oh, there's aliens that happen to use, I don't know. But anyway, so yes, let's talk more about the Romulan Vulcan connection, because yes, the whole shocking reveal, and they did this, was a contrived moment in my opinion, that they said there were no view screens just so I could have this moment like, oh my god, it's they look like Vulcans. And of course, when I first saw this episode, I had already seen The Next Generation, where I was like, well, where are the little bumps on their forehead? And why are they surprised they have ears? But here they look just like Vulcans, pretty much. And and Brandon mentioned in the chat the reason why they had most of the extras wearing the helmets is because it was too expensive to do the ears. So they was like, let's just hide their ears, so we don't have to do the Romulan ears. But anyway, I don't know. I don't think there's been anything in like official canon that really got into the background of the history of Romulans or how they came from Vulcan. I've noticed a lot of B canon that delved into this, and it was mentioned, like it was touched on, such as in the unification episodes, the Next Generation and the Discovery ones, that Romulans were originally from Vulcan. But in this episode, Spock kind of just says, oh, they could just be an offshoot of our Vulcan blood. So I don't think it was established in this episode that they were actually from Vulcan. They could have just been like the Mintakans in that episode who watches the Watchers, who just happen to look like Vulcans. But I don't know. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts, or maybe you can explain this more, if maybe you have a better memory of this whole history of Romulans coming from Vulcan. Alyssa, we'll start with you.
So was it stated in the later episodes of Unification that they did actually come from Vulcan, the planet Vulcan? Because I don't remember that.
I don't remember. Well, I'm not sure, to be honest. Because they're talking about reunification, so it's presupposing they were unified at one point.
Yeah,
and that they're unifying again.
Because in this episode, that's just a theory that Spock had. So my reading of this is that it's like the dinosaur dudes from Voyager. Like the history of it is lost. Like people didn't know. Like it happened so long ago that there's no record of that. So after Spock had that little theory, I'm sure there are other scientists did DNA tests and like determine, oh yes, Vulcans and Romulans are related, and they kind of have to speculate and do some science stuff on it and speculate, because it appears that since Spock didn't know, then that's been lost to history. So they don't actually remember. Nobody knows when this occurred. It just happened way back, a million years ago or whatever. But I assume the DNA test or whatever proved that they are from the same, come from the same root. In fact, I'm surprised it's kind of not like the dinosaur thing. We're like, no, we're not. We're not from your planet. We're our own. So I don't know if anyone knows for certain that they actually came from the planet Vulcan. They do end up there in Discovery because of the destruction of their planet, and so part of because their planet is gone, so they can. But I don't know if they ever could really say for certain that they came from Vulcan. I don't know how they would definitely know that, unless there's some archaeology, like they found ancient Romulan things buried in Vulcan or something.
Yeah, I think where I heard it said specifically they came from Vulcan is B canon, novels and stuff. Yeah. I don't think it was ever officially said in canon.
Yeah, I don't think they know. I feel like it's just something that they had to speculate on.
Don, do you want to weigh on this? Any thoughts on this?
I do think it's interesting just to see how, they kind of play with that whole thing, because, it's the kind of the theory of panspermia to a certain extent. But also possible corruption of culture, or how environments can change a culture. Because if the Romulans did come from Vulcan, right, but it was just like, hey, we had our own way of doing things. And we didn't like the way things were going on Vulcan so much. Pardon, sorry, getting over cold. We didn't like the way things were being done on Vulcan so much that we decided to leave the entire planet, right? And so they probably already had their own traditions, and this is if it has been established that they definitely were from Vulcan. They probably already had their own traditions, and then you throw in the fact that now they're on an unfamiliar planet, and things are going to evolve from there because now you have to deal with the different conditions of this place. And so, over hundreds, thousands, millions of years, or however long it has probably been for them, you know, um, now is where, when you actually do have these people meet again for the first time, it would be like you meeting a distant relative from wherever your ancestors are actually originally from. Like, how different would you guys be, even though you essentially came from the same place? So I just find it I find it fascinating the way that they decided to depict these two cultures with a shared ancestry, and just see like how how things have how things have evolved and changed when one family member moves away, and what happens when their offspring interact with the offspring of the people who basically stayed in their original region.
Yeah, that is a very interesting concept. I do wonder. The show, I think, was very vague about it, though. But like, I remember hearing, I think it was a novel I read saying that the whole wars with Sirach when he brought logic and this piece to Vulcan, and before they were emotional, and he made them all stoic and logical and everything, and that those Vulcans that rejected that way left the planet, went to Romulus, and Romulus was the natives were the Remans, and they kicked them out and exiled them to Reman, and took over the planet. That's an interesting concept, but I don't think that's canon. I think that's just something sort of other writers had made up in novels to sort of describe it. But I find it I think that I would buy that. But anyway, so in the chat, Flea Block says, were the Romulans meant to represent any contemporary society back in the 60s, like the USSR or Communist China? Did Roddenberry or anyone explain what the inspiration for the Romulans were? I don't recall. I think, as I said before, I think it's more a comparison to like Rome, the Roman Empire. I think the Klingons were meant to be the clear analogy to USSR and sometimes to Communist China. They were kind of both of them, or sometimes they would just go like, "My dear Captain Kirk." But anyway, but I think the Romulans were not really meant to be anything contemporary. I think that was more the Klingons.
Yeah, that's kind of how I read them too, but who knows?
And Brandon in the chat says that's what's on Memory Alpha. I guess the thing I described about maybe that's where I read it then, Memory Alpha, but I don't know where that's pulling it from.
Yeah, I don't know. If it's not mentioned in an episode, to me, it's not canon. I don't care what Memory Alpha says.
That's
Yeah, it's. I think sometimes they take things from like interviews or things that people say, or maybe they take things from B canon. If it's not mentioned in an episode, it is not canon, and I don't give a crap what Memory Alpha says. That's my feeling on it.
Fair enough. All right, so let us move on, and I want to talk about what Alyssa's screen name addresses: the gold bigoted styles. Now, I think Alyssa mentioned in her intro that she kind of had an issue with the storyline. I actually do. For me, this is the one sort of blemish of the episode. I think Styles, I mean, it's a good concept, but they take it too far. I think he's too obtuse. He's too like argumentative about like every little thing. Like even before the big reveal that the Romulans look like Vulcans, he's like kind of a dick, and he's like, "Oh, there could be Romulan spies on board." I'm like, really? Like, what are you basing that off of? That seems like the most outrageous statement, and it has no bearing on the episode later on. And then, of course, the whole time, Styles is just being complete dick to Spock and like, "Oh, how do you know this?" Blah blah blah. And And then at the end, of course, Spock saves his life. It's like, oh, Mr. Spock, I appreciate you so much more. So it was kind of an obvious storyline. It was, I mean, I like that he's bigoted and that they address his bigotry. And Kirk, that line he says is amazing, is one of my favorite lines from the episode. But I think they had it up at an 11 and need to crank it down to like 4. I think they just overdid it. Maybe this is the 60s outdatedness of it all. But anyway, Alyssa, since that's your screen, any thoughts on this?
I have thoughts. Yeah. It's funny. I happened to see a meme yesterday from this episode that just coincidentally that had on the first panel it had the line, there's no room for bigotry on the bridge, and the second panel is because we're a woke ship here, and the third panel is like woke, we are woke. They can just show show how ridiculous it is. The modern Trek is when Star Trek started becoming woke. Starting addressing issues like racism. When it's in one of the early episodes, there's the line, "There's no room for bigotry on my bridge." So I find that kind of funny. But I like that they wanted to show that we are anti-bigots. We are, we're for equality for all races. That's great. I have a hard time buying that there would be a bigot of any kind serving on the Enterprise in the 23rd century. People want to talk about all these things in Deep Space Nine and Modern Trek that go against Roddenberry's vision. Having a bigot on the Enterprise is going against Roddenberry's vision, even though Roddenberry was very much involved in the show. It's contradictory. The whole point of it is all of that has been eradicated long ago. So the fact that there would be someone who is so clearly bigoted against people with pointy ears serving aboard the Enterprise, I had a hard time swallowing that, and I think, I agree with you. They crank it up a little too high to 11. Like they can maybe turn the volume down on that a little bit. So I just found that whole character to be annoying. And you're right, he was like that even before they revealed what the Romulans looked like. And I just get this guy off the bridge. He's so who? And it's just the only episode he's in. Even who invited him on the bridge? when he goes down and Kirk is like, "Ahura, take the navigation station." I'm like, thank God, Ahura's not gonna whine and complain and second guess orders and all that stuff. So I just found this character kind of annoying, if I'm gonna be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And he have lines when Kirk is like, "Okay, Mr. Styles, can you move the ship? Oh, attack! We're going to move to attack. Yes, sir. No, we're not going to attack. Listen to my orders." But anyway, Don, your thoughts on Mr. Styles' bigotry?
This one goes up to 11. So, it's one of those things that, again, you're talking about a time, in terms of TV where this was groundbreaking. This subject matter and the way that they try to play it straight was, different for the time. So unfortunately, that kind of hinders the storytelling a bit because they're trying to do the whole pill in the dog food kind of thing with it, where it's like, well, you're supposed to be so evolved, and yet here you are hating someone just because they look different than you for no other reason than that, and making all of these assumptions about what they're probably up to and how they're trying to harm you and whatever else. But again, at the time, groundbreaking. So as much as I might want to rag on certain things about it, and just the fact it's like, oh, come on now, who's going to be that outwardly racist or bigoted against an alien species when you serve with aliens or aliens in the Federation, and B, you're on a starship, all you're gonna like your whole like the literal mission. It says it in in the intro, to seek out new life and new civilizations. So to have someone who's that blatantly bigoted, like looking back on it now, it's like, yeah, this actually didn't serve the overall narrative of the show, but for the actual episode, it did what it needed to do in terms of sending the message that it was trying to relate without necessarily beating you over the head as an audience member, or trying to throw it too hard in your face. Um, but again, yeah, at the time, this was probably one of those things where people were looking at it like, "Oh my God, what are you trying to say? Are you trying to say something about me?" You know, because we see that happen to this day. So yeah, listen, I happen to like it. Um, I happen to think that is deep subject matter, but it is one of those things where thinking back on, like you guys were saying, like it's the 23rd, 24th century or whatever may have you. Um, yeah, how is it that you have someone that can be that bigoted, possibly pass the psychological exam to serve on an intergalactic starship? You know, it's not like he's working at the corner bodega. He's going and into the stars to meet people from different planets. So yeah, again, while I like the episode and I know that it was groundbreaking for the time, just in retrospect, it doesn't really the concept unfortunately kind of falls short because of the fact that these are supposed to be the best of humanity, and you have someone who is outwardly displaying the worst of humanity to another culture.
Um, can I bring up? I want to just bring up something that's been brought up on the chat. There's been
Sure.
more modern comparisons of Brian's kind of he kind of has a bias against the Cardassians because of his feelings and that war, and Norman just brought up Shaw having hard feelings against the Borg, but neither of them are as just outright bigoted as Styles is, where he's just like, "Oh, Mr. Spock, what do you do?" I'm like, he's just way over the top. Like Mark said, turn the dial down a little bit. I would have been able to buy it a little bit more. Like I do buy O'Brien and I do buy Shaw. I know Mark doesn't like it. I like Shaw, but I do. I mean, yeah, I do buy the anti-Borg thing. If you were in Wolf 359. Traumatic experience. I get that. This dude, like, never even met Romulan. It's just like from some stories he heard from his grandpa, and he is the most ridiculous, over-the-top bigot that Star Trek has ever seen. So I don't see it as a one-to-one comparison. If you want to compare Styles to the way Brian or Shaw behaves toward a certain species, I think if you dialed Styles down from 11 down to maybe a 4 or 5, then maybe you could make that comparison. But I think he's way over the top. And he, unlike those other two, he doesn't have a personal traumatic experience. He's just, so his grandpa told him stories about the Romulans, and then so he's this over the top bigot. And I just can't, I don't buy it.
Yeah, I think, well, O'Brien, I think, is actually really bigoted. But as you said, he's got more of a reason to be. He's suffering from trauma from his experience in the war, where Styles is just stories his grandpa told him.
But O'Brien is still more of a professional when he has to do his job. He's not like defying orders because he's, you know, he makes comments like, "We can't let the Cardis take but when it comes, like, he will follow his captain's orders even if begrudgingly. He's still a professional, where this guy is just questioning orders all the time.
That's true. I mean, but he yelled at that guy just for wanting to get a drink with him.
It's not you, Mike. That's what I became because of you.
But yeah, no, I agree though. O'Brien is definitely much better handled character than Styles. Styles is just not. You just don't buy him. He's just too over the top. All right, so I wanted to move on to my final subject of the episode. I want to talk more about the Romulan commander himself, which I don't believe he was named in this episode. Commander
Sarek.
But anyway, as I mentioned at the start, this is one of my favorite things about the episode. I love how we get the scenes with him and his Centurion, and how he's like, the relationship they have is actually kind of similar to the relationship Kirk and McCoy have, and we see that contrasted with the scene with Kirk and McCoy. And there's Romulan hothead on that bridge disagreeing with him, kind of like the way Styles is being a hothead. And how he's like, the Centurion's like, be careful, that guy has powerful allies. He's like, and that's very dangerous. It's like, Danger and me are old friends. Like, that kind of dialogue, I think, is really good. And that's what sells it. Like, if we didn't have these scenes, I don't think it would be nearly as good as an episode. And that's what I was saying. I love that he's not twirling his mustache. I love that he's just a military commander who's just got on opposing sides with Kirk. And then at the end, where he sacrifices himself because it's, when he could surrender, he's like, that's not our way, and he'd rather just destroy the ship. Something very, I don't know if tragic is the right word, but something very melancholy about that always struck me, that always worked for me. And just the battle of wits he had without Kirk. And one of my favorite lines, and I think it's always been one of my favorite lines, is when he says to Kirk, in a different reality, we could have been friends. To me, that nails the episode, is that he has nothing personal against Kirk. It's just, and in fact, they are very similar. But they just happen to be on opposing sides. And yeah, I just love the way this is portrayed. So anyway, Alyssa, let's get your thoughts on this.
Well, first of all, I have to point out that when Quality of Mercy came out, there were some people who said they should have got the guy who played Sarek to play the Romulan commander. That would have been a little too much. Have the same guy Sarek in this. But I kind of would have, if they did, I would have been like, I see what you're doing there. But they didn't do that. Anyways, no, I absolutely agree. I think that's the strength of this episode, is getting to see from the enemy's point of view. And this is something the original series doesn't do a whole lot after this. Especially we get into the second season Klingons and we get, the third season episode Dave the Dove, I think, gets a little bit more of a Klingon point of view. But yeah, that was really good. It just kind of, it's like a chess match between Kirk and the Commander Sarek there. That's really fascinating. I wish they had toned down just a touch, the little, I really admire that commander. I really admire that opposing commander. I'm like, I get it. Like, I feel like they said, I just watched the episode and they say it like almost every scene that they were talking. And when the other one does a move, they're like, he's really smart. I think they could have like maybe toned that down just a touch. But I do really, really love what they were doing with that. They really do admire each other, even though they are on opposing sides. And yeah, the scene at the end where he says, in another reality, we could have been friends. That is really powerful. And then Kirk's like, come on over. We'll save you. And he's like, no, we must. That was a really powerful scene as well. So I think that is the strength of this episode, and that is why I would even consider it for my top 10, favorite episodes of the original series. That is like what really puts this episode above and beyond most other TOS episodes.
Oh, no, absolutely, totally agree. And Don, your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So yeah. Just again, seeing how You have these two men who are captains of this ship, and while they are the heads of their respective ships, they still are subject to the higher, upper echelons of their governments and the things that they are kind of forced to do in the names of those governments. So, it's just interesting to see how it's like, hey, I don't necessarily want to be here doing this, but I have a job I have to do. And, so like the gentleman said, in another life we could have been friends. I mean, it's just one of those things where, yeah, it's like, hey, you know what? I don't really want to be doing this, but I got a job to do. I swore my oath to the government or whatever may have you, and I'm like, even though they say Star Trek is not a military, I mean not Star Trek, Starfleet is not a military. Pretty sure, if you're in the Romulan Space Navy, you're definitely it's definitely military. So, he's got to uphold his oath and his duty. And at the end, like you said, him sacrificing himself and saying, "Hey, yeah, this is our way of doing things." You know, accepting help from an enemy is not how we do things. Yeah, it's one of those things. It's like, man, it kind of makes you think, about just how different, things could be. Um, excuse me. Sorry, please stay out of the cold, people, so you don't want to get sick like me. Anyway, yeah, it's just one of those things where, like I said, when you just see how they uh the culture clash. Yeah, but the thing that kind of kills me about this whole thing is like the way that the Romulans were established is not how they end up later on. Because if you think about it, the Romulans were the ones that at first were kind of seen like as the not necessarily noble savages, but they were kind of more like diplomats to a certain extent that happened to also be this imperial force. And then later on, they just became kind of this imperial force that was all about backstabbing and assassinations. And it's like, yeah, you guys used to be a little bit more above board. And when did you guys become all about espionage and sabotage and things like that?
Well, that's interesting because that touches on something else I've heard. I've heard several people recently say that the Romulans and the Klingons were switched from how they were portrayed in the original series to later in the franchise with the movies and TNG, because they were saying the Romulans were the honorable ones in the original series and the Klingons were the devious ones, and they swapped that later. But I'm not sure I agree with that because, well, particularly the Klingons in season 3 with Dave the Dove were definitely seen as honorable, and I think the Klingons are also in keeping with how they portrayed in season 1. I think it's just the second season which was you can just throw out and disregard, and I think the Klingons are pretty consistent. Now the Romulans, yeah, later in the original series, I guess the only time we really see them in person is the Enterprise incident, I believe. I think we see their ships a couple times. But in the Enterprise incident, they were definitely more all about espionage. And I would say that change was made there and not the movies or the originals or the TNG. So I think the original series is very inconsistent with how they portrayed both races, and so when they were doing later stuff, they just had to pick a road, and then it solidified how they were.
Well, I think there's an in-universe explanation for that because you were talking earlier about how the Romulans were testing the waters for war, and then once that war didn't happen, then they switched to espionage. I think that's a simple explanation, and like you said, it happens in Enterprise incident, it happens in TOS, so it's not even, and they don't even wait for Next Generation before that switch happens.
Yeah, true. And also, let's see, Norman in the chat says the Tal Shiar was not introduced until Face of the Enemy. But even before Face of the Enemy, they were shown as devious and about espionage, I believe.
Was that the first time they were mentioned? Was
Yeah.
Face of the Enemy? Okay.
Yeah, that was the first mention of the Tal Shiar. I do remember that. Yeah. But even in like the third season with Tom Locke sending spies to the Federation, they were always shown as like scheming and devious even before they mentioned the Tal Shiar.
Yeah.
True indeed, but still, there's something about them seemed a little more above board. Excuse me, maybe I'm just looking at the Romulans from the TOS era with rose-colored glasses because of episodes like this.
Well, I think it might just be this episode, but you can always explain that away with, well, it's just this one guy. And even this episode had that, the underling who was like threatening him, who had powerful friends like this. So there was implications that there was something shady going on.
Yeah,
but anywho,
I guess. Yeah.
All right. Well, that is pretty much everything I wanted to cover with this episode. So I want to end this video as I'm going to make it a tradition with all my top 25 live discussions. When I have guests, I shall ask my guests, where would you put this, you think, roundabouts on your own personal top 25 of the entire franchise? Would it be higher, lower, around the same? Best estimation? John, can we start with you? Where do you think you would have this?
Honestly speaking, for me personally, because I really like this episode a lot, and the fact that I kind of ruined it for myself, thinking about the logic bomb, it was like, oh my god! I honestly speaking, I probably would have put this at number 12 before, but now I've got to bump it down to number 22, just because no, now I'll never be able to look at it the same way. You're telling me that they had no, how did I not think about this before?
So it would probably be around about the same then, as I have it around.
Yeah, because I mean, as much as I love about the episode, thinking about some of the things that, thinking about some of the things that don't hold up as well as they could have. Like I said, I understand for the time period that many of the TOS stories were groundbreaking. Nothing like it had ever been done on television before. I get that. But the unfortunate part is now you have this whole long drawn out narrative and you have these stories that don't fit.
Now that's true. That's something to consider. I will say, when I made my announcement video, Brandon made a comment saying, "Oh, well, I expected this to be higher on your list," and I guess I would cite the same reasons of why it's not higher on my list, because the Styles thing was over the top, and it is a bit. Some of it's a bit outdated, but I still love this episode enough for it to make my top 25 list of the entire franchise, which is an achievement. It was fucking hard to boil it down to just 25 episodes for the entire franchise. But anyway, Alyssa, how about you? Higher, lower, around the same?
Well, Mark, I can kind of make a little bit of a soft announcement here, is that I am working on, or sometime in the near future, going to do my own top 100. Ooh. I'm not going to do one episode at a time. That would take 10 years, but it's probably going to be 25 episodes at a time at first. And then once we get closer, I'll break it down a little bit more. That's hopefully I will get that going later this year. So I've already been thinking about these sorts of things, and this absolutely is not in my top 25, but will somewhere be in my top 100, possibly my top 50. I would have to look at it. But my top 25, I think, is going to be pretty well dominated by TNG and Deep Space Nine. There will be Enterprise, Voyager, and TOS kind of sprinkled in there. I'm not going to include Modern Trek because a lot of those are still ongoing, and it would be weird to do a top 100 and then, then like next year, oh, but this new Modern Trek episode came out. So I just excluding Modern Trek entirely for that reason and just focusing on Legacy Trek, the first 5 shows. I don't count the animated series, and the animated series wouldn't make it anyways. But looking at that, my top 25 is probably going to be very well dominated by TNG and Deep Space Nine, and there's no room for bigotry on the bridge, and there's no room for this episode in my top 25. But I think top 50 is a very realistic possibility, but you'll find out later in the year whenever I get around to doing these videos. But top definitely, 100% is in my top 100 somewhere. Top 50 very likely, but not top 25. So to answer your question, I would have it a little lower on my list than 25.
Yeah. Fair enough. And since you bring up Modern Trek, I did want to mention that I was going back and forth of whether or not I should include Modern Trek in my top 25 for the same reasons. It's kind of new and ongoing. But the decision I came to was I did decide to consider Modern Trek and include it, but my cutoff point was when I did my top 20 favorite episodes of Modern Trek, which I did a couple months ago. So it was before season 3 of Lower Decks aired. So anything before that was considered. And so I did consider 3 episodes or 4 episodes almost made it, but only 1 episode from Modern Trek did make it, which I think it is somewhat related to this episode. It was the only one that actually did make it. So there's only 1 in there, but it was considered. But anywho, Don, Alyssa, any final thoughts before we sign off here?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I just want to say that again. I think this was brilliant for the fact that they were able to show these different cultures and the different perspectives that we got from Kirk versus whatever the Romulan commander's name was. Just to see the mutual respect that they were able to garner for each other, but at the same time recognizing that, hey, look, yeah, we respect each other, but we're still enemies. At the end of the day, we are on the opposite side. Period. Point blank. But just because we are on the opposite side doesn't mean that everything has to be hostile. And that's the thing that I like about this episode. And you know what? If only we could bring some of that to the real world.
Fair enough. And totally agree. That was definitely a high point of the episode. Now I will address the chat because Norman Buchwald very correctly guessed the episode from Modern Trek that would make my top 25. 2 of 1, the episode from Picard season 2 where Girardi sings and someone just puts the spotlight in. Yeah, that's total. That absolutely is the episode that will appear in my top 25. Anyway, yes, I want to thank everyone for joining. Everyone joining the chat. Doman, Brandon, Jordan, War Hero 99. Hello, how's it going? And I believe we had a few people earlier up there. Trying to scroll up to find them, but a flea block. Yep. Thanks so much for joining. Anyway, thanks everyone for joining the chat, everyone who's watching this in the archives. And of course, thank you very much for my special guests for agreeing to come on to talk about my top 25 episodes. It's fun having this more dynamic discussion. If you want to give a quick shout out of where people can find you, what you're up to, Don, a Romulan of Ice and Fire, we'll start with you.
Hey, so again, as always, thank you for having me here. It is always a pleasure to sit down and talk nerd stuff with you, especially Star Trek. So yeah, you can find me on Twitter at @IDonWilli. That is IDonWilli. Or you can find me here on YouTube. Excuse me, at A Dawn of Ice and Fire. Even though I haven't put out a video in a very, very long time. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, and always you can find me here on this gentleman's channel, guesting for things like this. So again, Mark, thank you for having me. Alyssa Jean, glad to see you. It's been a while. All right, and yeah, Mark, take it away.
Well, Alyssa, what are you up to and where can people find you?
I am reviewing Picard Season 3 weekly. I'm on Alyssa Jean's Reviews. You should check it out if you haven't. I'm reviewing Star Trek Picard weekly, and I just recently uploaded my 2 videos for Star Trek Enterprise. I did my 20 favorite episodes of Star Trek Enterprise and my 10 least favorite episodes of Star Trek Enterprise, which completes the collection. I have now done all of the 5 legacy Trek shows that way. So you should check those out. Yeah, I'll see you there.
Cool. And if you're finding me for the first time, my name is Mark. My channel is Enchantment of Eternity. Like Alyssa, also covering season 3 of Picard, except I'm a bit more cynical about it, which is just me. And I'm also going through the original series, covering every episode. I'm up to the 2nd season at the moment, so releasing 2 or 3 of those reviews a week. And then, of course, next month I will be back with my number 24. Ooh. So be sure to join me for that. And thanks for joining me tonight. And we will see you all next time.